Start your habit of continuous learning today. Visit nomadphp.com.
Welcome to Nomad PHP Lightning Talks. I'm Joe Ferguson. Nomad PHP Lightning Talks are 10-minute talks that give a high-level overview or an in-depth look at a small portion of a PHP-related topic. Lightning Talks are a great way for new speakers to build their speaking resume or for long-time speakers to test drive new talk ideas. If you'd like to give a 10-minute Lightning Talk, please email me, joe@nomadphp.com. Right now we have Gareth Ellis, and he's going to talk about how to write more expressive tests with Hamcrest PHP. Please make sure you visit JoinDen after the talk and leave Gareth some feedback.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Nomad PHP, for having me again. And I'm going to talk to you about a great little library that I love to use called Hamcrest PHP and how it can help you write more expressive test assertions. So let's start with the obvious question. What is Hamcrest? Hamcrest is a matcher library. It's nothing to do with ham, unfortunately, for those carnivores in the audience. It's a matcher library originally written in Java. It's been ported to lots of other languages, including our beloved PHP. And it allows for more expressive assertions in your tests. There are some usages for Hamcrest outside of tests, which I'll talk about, but for me personally, I get the most mileage out of it when using it in unit and integration tests. So what I mean by a matcher library is it just lets you match values against other values, and on a very basic level, something like the is_string, a function in PHP could be considered a matcher. So here's some code which may look familiar to you. At the top in the yellow we have a PHP unit assertion. This assert equals to $sum value. Now I don't know about you, but I always forget which way round the arguments to this method go, which one is the expected value and which one is the actual value, and I have to go and check that quite often when doing it. The Hamcrest version, you can see below in orange, says doesn't have that problem because it's obvious from the syntax, because it just reads like plain English. Assert that some value is equal to 2. Very straightforward, and this is really the power of Hamcrest. This is what I mean by writing expressive assertions. It gives you semantically meaningful language right there in your code. So here's a real-world example which I'm using with very kind permission of the author. And this comes from a blog post where the author was having difficulty with a fragile test. And as you can see, there's a data source object which is returning an array of items with its getFood method. And the test was just checking that the returned array, $food, contained all of the items in the $fruit array. The problem was that the database call, which was happening in the data source, was not ordered. So depending on the exact environment that the code was running on, the $food array was coming out with in a different order in different environments. So here is the solution for testing that the same values appear in both arrays in PHP unit style. And very simply, what it's doing here is checking that there are no differences between $food and $fruit using array_diff. And then because of the way array_diff works, it has to check them with the values the other way around. So you've got 2 lines to check for the same thing. Now I don't know about you, but when I first read those lines of code, I had to spend a couple of minutes thinking about it, reading it. I even had to look up array_diff and how that works, just to kind of work out exactly what it was doing. And this is a problem which I think can be addressed really nicely with a Hamcrest matcher. So here's the Hamcrest equivalent of this code. Assert that $food contains only values from $fruit. So this is really where Hamcrest becomes useful for me. It allows you to spend far less time reasoning about what your assertions are doing, and because it's written in what looks like very natural English, you can write quick, easy, and expressive assertions in your code. Now this particular matcher contains only values from is actually a custom matcher that I wrote specifically so that I could address this problem using Hamcrest, and I'll come on to how you can create a custom matcher a little later on after I've showed you some of the built-in matchers that come with Hamcrest PHP. So there are matchers that work with a variety of types, both primitives and with objects. So number matchers, for a start, do exactly what you think they do. They match numeric values. Assert that 3 is greater than 2, for example. Assert that some value is at most 99. There's also an at least matcher. There's all kinds of other matches that you could, all the kind of matches you could imagine for operating on numbers. There's a whole bunch of string matches as well built in. Again, they do all sorts of things you'd expect string matches to do. So assert that some string is equal to ignoring case a string. There's also one which is something like equal to ignoring white space. I've written a custom matcher which is equal to ignoring line breaks or something along those lines, which is really useful if you've got some file which has been produced by someone on Windows and has got the CRLF line ending types, and you're comparing it to a file which is being generated by code running on Mac or Linux, which has the LF line endings. So that's really useful. Assert that some string contains string. Again, that's just a substring matcher. And assert that some string starts with foo. Again, don't really need to. The beauty of Hamcrest, I think, is you don't really need to explain what they do because they're so self-descriptive. There's also an ends with and lots of other string matchers. I'm not going to list them all out. Type matchers, exactly what you think they are. Assert that $object is an instance of some class. Assert that string is string value. You can also wrap it in any matcher in a not, which just inverts the meaning. So is not string value, that works fine as well. There's similar matches for all the other types in PHP as well: int value, float value, null value, array value, and so on. And just quickly, you can also see on several of these slides, with several of these matches, there's an is function wrapping around these, and these don't actually do anything. They just provide additional semantic expressiveness to help things read nicely. I think they're referred to as is referred to as a pass-through matcher within the Hamcrest source, and I really like it just because it makes things just read a little bit more nicely. There's also some inclusion and exclusion matches. So assert that $option is any of, and then an array of whitelisted options, and you can do similar with none of for a blacklist. Array matches let you match stuff in arrays, as you might think. Assert that an array contains some value, so that will match if the array contains that value. Assert that array is array containing in any order. Again, very useful if your array is coming out in an uncertain order. And assert that array is array with size. Just check the size of an array, very simple. And there's lots of other array matches you can use. You can also combine matches really nicely. So you can chain matches like this. Assert that a string is both string value and also not empty string. Very trivial example. Not sure when you'd ever actually want to use something like that. But it's a good example of the way you can chain a couple of matches together and it still retains semantic meaningfulness, and it's very easy to read and reason about what's going on. So usage. As with most libraries these days, you install it with Composer. The package name is Hamcrest/Hamcrest-PHP. I also recommend installing this package if you're using PHP unit, Graze/Hamcrest-test-listener. Once you've installed that package, you can update your PHP unit config with these lines, and that adds a test listener to PHP unit. And all that does is it means that PHP unit will accurately count and listen to the assertions that Hamcrest makes. So if you don't install this package, when you run your tests, if like me you like seeing how many assertions you've made in a test, without this listener you won't be able to see that. It'll just say 0 assertions. You also need to include Hamcrest's global functions. These aren't auto-loaded when you auto-load with Composer, presumably because they're trying to avoid any BC breaks. And the functions aren't namespaced because I believe the Hamcrest maintainers want to maintain some backwards compatibility with older versions of PHP, and before PHP 5.6 auto-loading functions is a bit tricky. So you can either put this require line in your test bootstrap, or you can auto-load a single file using Composer, like this. And then just quickly to finish, I'd like to talk about custom matches. These are where the real power of Hamcrest comes in for me, and we have built quite a lot of custom matches at work. I've also got a small library, a small open source library of custom matches that I've published. I'll give you a link to the end at the end of this. And custom matches really enable you to do some pretty cool stuff when you're writing test assertions. So I don't know if you've ever done anything like this in a test. So in this particular example, I was writing an integration test in Cake PHP 2. The subject under test was my controller. And in my test, I was testing for all sorts of things that my controller action had done. So I was checking that something had happened in the database and something else. And then at the end, I wanted to check that my controller had redirected to a given URL. So what I ended up doing in my test was, first of all, I defined the URL that I was expecting it to redirect to. And then I have to check that the controller's response status code is set to 302. Then I have to check that the controller has a location header set. And finally, I have to check that that header location is set to that redirect URL. So, I mean, this works, but it's not very easy to read. It's 4 lines of code. And of course, if you ever want to do anything like this, again, in another test, you've got to repeat those 4 lines of code. And no one wants to spend time repeating kind of boilerplate like this, when you could just do this instead. Set the controller redirected to URL. Much easier, much simpler, much easier to read. So how do we do that? Well, first thing to understand is that the assert that function takes any value as its first argument, and as the second argument, it just takes an instance of a matcher. And these functions we can see, they're just factories that instantiate those matchers. And what happens under the hood is that assert that takes the value that you pass in as the first argument and passes it to the matches method of the matcher instance that you give it as the second argument. If that matches method returns true or truthy, the matcher will pass and nothing will happen. Otherwise, it will throw an exception. So here's an example of that controller redirect matcher that I was showing just now. So in order to make a custom matcher, you have to extend from Hamcrest base matcher and then implement a couple of methods, namely matches, which is what does the actual match, and that has to return truthy. And then you have to implement describe to, and I'll come to that in a moment what that does. So in our constructor here, we're just passing in the URL that we're matching against, and our controller is being passed into matches by assert that, so you can see that in the matches method. So in our matches method, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check that the controller is actually an instance of controller by putting a matcher inside of our matcher. And then we're just going to put that same logic we saw in our test assertion before inside the matches method. So we're going to check that we've got a location header set, and if we don't have one set, we're going to return false because the match is going to fail. And then we're going to check those other items, i.e. that the response status code is set correctly and that our header location is set to the URL that was passed in the constructor. Very straightforward. So this is what it looks like if Hamcrest throws an exception. This is the nice message you get. It tells you what it expected to get. In this case, assert that foo is int value. Well, it's not, obviously not an int value because it's a string, so it expected to get an integer, and then it tells you what it actually got. So describe to, that method, describe to, tells you what Hamcrest expected to get. So in this case, we are just going to say Hamcrest expected to get controller, which had a status code of 302, and a header location containing, and then we pass it the URL. Append text just outputs a bunch of text, and append value will wrap any kind of value and output it in a nice human readable fashion. You can also describe a mismatch, which is the text. If I just go back a couple of slides, that's the text that comes out in the but was section here. So in this case, we're just going to describe the actual state of controller. So describe mismatch takes the item that was passed to matches as its first argument, and then an instance of description, Hamcrest description, as its second. And so here we're just saying, well, the controller response status code was this, and then it's describing what happened with the location header, either that it wasn't set or that it was set to something wrong. and that means you get a nice, expressive and helpful error message when your matcher fails. Then finally, we just need to wrap it in a factory function, and then we get our nice, readable, semantically expressive test assertion. So I'll just very quickly finish with a couple of other things you can use Hamcrest for. It's also quite cool for you reducing boilerplate. If you can't use PHP 7 scalar type hints for any reason, then you might do something like if it's not a string, then throw in valid argument exception. Well, you can do the same thing in Hamcrest. A little bit more expressive, just one line of code, reads very easily. Pretty cool. You can also use matchers as callables. So because a matcher, when it's used as a callable, just invokes its matches method, which returns truthy, you can use it with array filter or with a filter method on a collection. So here's a very simple example. We've got an array containing 3 strings: hello, Nomad PHP, hello, Gareth, and goodbye. And then we're just filtering to find the ones which start with hello, which will leave us with an array with just 2 elements in. You can also use Hamcrest with a couple of mocking libraries. Both mockery and fake come with Hamcrest support built in. And you can see a couple of examples on the screen there of how you can use Hamcrest matches with those libraries. Thank you very much for listening. I'm at Gareth Ellis on Twitter, and the link on the screen there will take you to my open source Hamcrest matcher library. It's got a couple of cool custom matchers like a JSON string matcher and a UUID matcher and a few other things. So if you use Hamcrest, please take a look at that library. I'm sure you'll find it useful. Thanks very much for having me, and that's it.
Thanks for joining us for another Nomad PHP Lightning Talk. If you'd like to give a Lightning Talk, please email me, joe@nomadphp.com. Please make sure you visit Joined In and leave Gareth some feedback.